Good evening. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Francis Hunger. Francis lives and works in the city of Leipzig, which is in the part of Germany that used to be known as East Germany. And he's old enough to remember what it was like then to live in the context of Soviet socialism, more or less, or the German flavor of Soviet socialism. Leipzig, if you're not familiar with it, is a medium-sized city about 2 hours south of Berlin by train, not too far from Dresden. I met Francis in 2003, I think. Maybe it was 2004? Five? In 2005. Spring of 2005 then. When he was a visiting scholar at Columbia University, where I was working at the time. He was situated in the visual art department at Columbia, so basically in the department that is our counterpart there. We met for coffee a few times, and he tried to explain his research to me. His explanations were terrific, and I think I understood some of it. The focus of his research then, as I recall, was primarily into the history of information technology in the Soviet Union. And one thing I remember in particular that he was interested in was something that I had never at the time heard of, trinary computing. So you're all familiar with digital, right? Binary computing. So all of our computers are based on a two-state solution, if you will. On or off. It's either a 1 or a 0. But there were these really interesting computer scientists in Russia who developed, I think it was Russia, who developed a kind of computing based on 3 states. I guess, I don't even know what the 3 states were. You could maybe tell me later, but it wasn't just a 1 and a 0. What was the third state?
-1.
-1.
We'll talk about it.
You are? Okay, so I won't go into too much detail. This is what I remember of our interactions, and for me, it just really stuck in my mind. Partly because it was something with which I was completely unfamiliar, but also he just really impressed me as a young artist whose practice was based really deeply in serious research. Not the kind of superficial research I do, but really digging down into things. In Francis's recent work, he's still into research. It combines what he calls artistic research. So I think that means art practice as a kind of research practice, in addition to media theoretic research, so research of the kind that a media theory scholar might do, and also, honestly, probably the kind of research that a media historian or media archaeologist or someone who does history of science and technology might do. And also narration, which isn't exactly the same thing as storytelling, but is similar, in the form of installations and radio plays and radio performances and, not least, internet-based art. It probably doesn't need to be said, the kind of things that tend to be sold at David Zwirner Gallery and his peers. Another kind of practice that's situated in other kinds of institutional contexts, such as Halle 14 in Leipzig, Q21 in the Museumsquartier in Vienna, really interesting space, ACC Gallery in Weimar, the Museum of Nonconformist Art in St. Petersburg, Russia, the European Media Art Festival in Osnabrück, the Städtisches Museum in Zittau, Gallery Wedding in Berlin, here in New York at Cooper Union, D21 in Leipzig, the Bergen Assembly Triennial in Norway, the Württembergische Kunstverein in Stuttgart, the Center for Contemporary Art in Moscow, where I showed once, Hardware Medien Kunstverein, which is the Hardware Media Art Collective, I guess, in Dortmund, and Kunsthalle Faust in Hanover, among other places. He's taught at the Academy of Art and Design in Burg Giebichenstein from 2008 to 2017. And since 2015, so slightly overlapping with his teaching, he's been pursuing a PhD at Bauhaus University in Weimar. And his research focus is on the underlying concepts of electronic database technology, its historical roots, and social and cultural friction. His work and his research, which are really fused together, realize, and this is his words, a critical examination of the historiography of technology as ideologically charged knowledge and power constellations. That's quite a mouthful, but let me try to unpack it. So I think his use of the word realize is really interesting. So he says the first part of this is his works realize a critical examination of ... So one could say, if one were trying to be less verbose, that his works critically examine. But I think what he's saying is that they don't just do it, like he's being really precise. Works don't examine things. That would be to personify them. What they do is realize or make manifest or put into reality a critical examination that he's doing. So I thought that was very interesting. And it's not a critical examination of the history of technology, but the historiography of technology. Now, what's the difference between history and historiography? Historiography is how history is done. So he's critically examining not the history of technology itself, but how the history of technology is written, how it's told. So they realize a critical examination of this historiography of technology as, not just in any way, but as ideologically charged constellations of knowledge and power. So what he's interested in is how knowledge and power, which if you're a big reader of 20th century European continental philosophy, bring to mind the work of Michel Foucault. For Foucault, they're almost inextricable. Like knowledge is power is knowledge in his theory, which helps you understand really how philosophy can actually be more than just academically relevant. So the historiography of technology as something that is a charged form, ideologically charged form of constellations or configurations. Constellations are groups of stars in the sky, knowledge and power. So I just thought that was really worth reading carefully and digging into. Please join me in giving a warm and enthusiastic welcome to Mr. Francis Hunger.
Wow, thanks. Thanks for the generous invitation, Mark. I'm really stoked to be here. Many thanks also to Alison, who organized the whole thing. I think Alison is really great. I hope you guys value her work as well. I think so. Thanks for attending to you, despite the very complicated text that I put forward for what we are doing here. And I think Mark has framed it beautifully. I have decided to show a selection of 5 works. No, it's more in the meanwhile. So when beginning this presentation, then it were 5 works. So now it's more, which focuses on narration in relation to media art and to the early digital, the digital and the post-digital. So what I would like to focus on is how storytelling interacts with objects in installations. And this approach has a double dimension. The story itself must be presented in an accessible way to the visitors of an exhibition, for instance, through putting text on the wall or any other means of reading the text, or it can be audio, or it can be both in video form or just through an audio play. And the second dimension is the spatial distribution So how are objects distributed in space, and what kind of narration does this create? And today I only discuss installations and artworks in a narrower sense, and I'm going to leave out other parts of my practice, that is curating workshops and lectures. So therefore, I'm having these books to pass around that also reflect on these other practices. Yeah, let's move on to the first project. So this is, I'm starting with what Marcus mentioned. 2005, New York, Columbia University. See, I'm much younger there. Not yet a dad. And I'm having this, yeah, I like these clothes very much. So this is during the setup of the installation. You're going to see the installation soon. So what I did was this research about a specific Soviet computer of the 1950s during the Cold War called Cytun computer. And therefore, I translated original sources from Russian for the first time to German and to English to make them available. And while at Columbia University, I used the library there to find out how US scientists learned about the Cytun computer that was on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So what was so special, Mark already mentioned it, the Cytun computer did not calculate with 0 and 1, with no and yes, but it had 3 different states of logic, -1 for no, 1 for yes, and 0, so to say, for both. And yeah, in this office, I'm sitting there and performing, and I'm telling a story, and the story goes like, yeah, the ternary Cytun computer was constructed in 1958 at Moscow State University. Over 70 copies were made. I'm telling about the creation by a team of engineers, and that it was abandoned due to an American spy in the program. Here you see another installation view in Kassel in Germany with this beautiful waiting line. So these are 12 meters space. I was really happy to get this large space for this kind of nonsense. On the right wall over there, you see 2 slide projections. One showing the group of inventors, and another one which we don't see really well that's the computer itself, like really a large machine that would probably fill half of the stage space here. As I said, late 1950s. And here on the left, we got the signboard, and the signboard has a list of rules for the visitors of this installation and performance. So it says, please line up accordingly, keep a discretion distance, make up your questions during your wait. And the last point, and maybe the most important, we only answer questions, no comments from your side are allowed. And I was like strictly enforcing this rule. So if anybody would start to make a comment on something or suggest that there would be something different from what I was telling, I would like interrupt her or him and say, sorry, if you continue to make comments, you have to leave. So this only works if you put forward a question I'm gonna answer. Also, people who try to like shorten their way going through, I had enough time sitting there, so I could be like really harsh with them and tell them to turn around and please not go this way. Yeah, I used these cardboard-made cards that helped me to tell the story. They are kind of a boundary object for conveying knowledge to the visitors. And for the visitor, it becomes kind of unclear if all that is made up, if that's that's a completely fictional thing, or if there's some truth to it. And the same is about the setup of the counter. I'm showing the backside to you, so you see how it's made from cardboard. And the important point in the construction was like the instruction to those people who were setting it up with me together was like, let's build it in a way that it looks firm from the outside, but if you come close and lean against it, it's shaky. It's not what it is. So it's not only the story that I'm telling at the counter, but also the space tells, and the setup in the space tells a story. And as I think, a story of knowledge and of power. The waiting line constructs the visitor as a visitor subject, and the counter, which seems firm and assuring, as does my suit here, this beautiful suit, it contradicts the sometimes wonky story. So there's a struggle going on between this institutional setup, the narration, and the viewer experience. And I was looking into how knowledge is created and conveyed through institution, in this case I am the institution there, and through language, and how this relates to power, the power to say something or not, and that's, as Mark mentioned, a classic Foucaultian approach, which at that time I didn't know, I just did it from my gut, so at that time in 2005 I hadn't yet read Foucault, and just like recently in the frame of my PhD I actually read stuff from him. So in 2008, 3 years later, I got the chance to produce a book, and I'm very, very happy that I didn't do it by myself. It's one of the common mistakes that you can do as an artist is you think, oh yeah, I can create things, let's make a book. So Helmut is a professional graphic designer, and he made this beautiful, beautiful book of which I couldn't bring a copy because all are sold out and given away. These have been 300 copies, and I couldn't find one at home when I was scrapping my stuff. So I hope I can ask my mother next time. She has one, I know. So here you see this double strategy. On the one hand, I'm having the artwork, a fictional narration, a kind of a poetic approach, an artistic approach. And then on the other hand, I have a publication of evidence, of material, or also of own theory that relates to the artistic research. So, next work. History exhaustion is a story that is told by a narrator, and it's a story that that goes about a jobless worker, an entrepreneur, and a student. So the worker has a hobby, he's a radio amateur, and someday he receives so-called number station. Number stations have been used during the Cold War. It's basically just someone reading a sequence of numbers, and one person who has kind of a secret code with her or with him can decipher it. So the good thing about number stations is you just send it around and nobody can locate who actually receives it. And so those of you who have seen the TV series, The Americans may actually know it because there it's popularly shown to the public. So this worker goes for the number station and he proposes to have a hike for the origins of the number station, and the hike goes through this mountainous area, which is here in these pictures. And let's just listen to it a little bit. So this sound of the number station was present at all time in the exhibition space, and it really transformed the space because that's something that you wouldn't expect in this kind of setup. Yeah. And what they do now to find the location of the number station is that they hike through this mountainous area, and somehow it has strange names. So one is called Path of the Invisible Hand. And another place is called Hill of Social Democracy. And another place again is called High Ground of Real Socialism. The student during the story at one point fell over the edge of the gorge of foreshortened critique of capitalism. And the entrepreneur, he heads on to the massive of capitalism and gets lost at the precipice of the crisis of overproduction. The worker continues to the unknown area, searching for the number station, and well, he also gets lost in the end. So this story, this narration, is presented in the exhibition through this book. And now, today, I think it was not like a very good decision to make a book, because you would start to look into it and you would not immediately find the page that actually tells the story. So in later versions, I tried other things like text projected on a wall that scrolls down, basically like a title from a movie. I developed this narration using this map, which I created on my own by myself, and I imagined how my protagonists would walk around these areas with these strange names. The map itself didn't end up in the installation. I had the feeling it's too concrete, it's showing too much and explaining too much, so after using it for development, then I kind of skipped it and put it away, and I'm just showing it to you to explain a little bit what's going on. So the space is set up like this. On the wall you have the pictures of these mountains. Then you have this beautiful radio receiver with this very large antenna, which is it's not straight in the space, but it goes like in this direction into the space. And here on the back, there's the book presented. And what I was interested in is ambivalent characters. So it was a look into how ideology functions and how humans move in between ideological fields. So the entrepreneur, for instance, as a figure, how I constructed it for this story, is trapped in a condition of denying social responsibility on the one hand for his actions, and on the other hand, in the constant need for constant self-improvement, for being the best. That's kind of the trap he's in, and it's an ideological trap in my interpretation. The student has her own demons. In her capitalism critique, she only sees personified relations, so she always puts it on persons. So, yeah, it's Mark Zuckerberg, it's that and that and that. Well, at that time, Zuckerberg wasn't that much around. That's 2009. So, and she ignores structural power. And hence, she falls into the gorge of foreshortened critique of capitalism. The worker is he's very attached to his own status as a worker and to the idea that life should be organized by work and especially by wage labor. So that's kind of what he has to deal with all the time. And we are meeting here two modes of ideology. The official state ideology and its flip side, the implicit, unvoiced values. And that's very interesting for artists, implicit, unvoiced values, because I think artists are able to voice them. And these implicit values support and reproduce official ideology in form of a dirty secret, which has to be kept discreet and is split off as the society's subconscious. Maybe we can elaborate on that later, because now I see it's very dense what I'm telling at the moment. So the worker is on the one hand looking for something new, the utopos, the other place, yet also captivated in the principle of wage labor. So the way how he can think is formed by thinking in wage labor, and he cannot think differently. And I find it a very interesting revelation that I think it fits to all of us, but in very different ways, depending on where we are coming from. We are only able to think in a way that we are able to, and it's very difficult to step outside the way that we are thinking. I'm always try to keep that in mind when thinking and when doing art. Part of the show were also 3 video performances, and I'll show 2 of them, The Entrepreneur and The Worker. They were presented in a side space here. I don't have a good picture of that, so I'm just showing them directly, and I'm just showing short excerpts. So I don't know if you can read that. It says capitalism must win, and it's kind of an inside joke. So all people who were born in Eastern Germany would understand that, because there were like large banners that would say socialism will win. So there was a security that at one point socialism will be all over the world successfully. And I kind of turned it into, well, capitalism must win in the sense of it has to win, there's no other option. It's kind of an ironic comment. So I'm standing there at that street for about 20 minutes, nobody picks me up, nobody reacts on that, then I'm just leaving again, and I'm moving out of the frame of this video, and that's the performance, that's it. Next performance, that's The Worker. And maybe first I'm gonna show it and then I'm gonna comment on it.
Алло. Алло. Видишь ветер? Ну и что? Посмотри в окно. Ну и что? А вчера было солнце. Ну и что? Зачем ты все время говоришь одно и то же? А я автоответчик.
Взять и успокоиться, золото молчание, радио бессонница, станция прощание. Кто кому достанется, выпадет монетками, кто кому останется, нервами, таблетками. За ночными окнами закричит, сломается. Это не считается, это не считается. Верная, неверная, тихая, печальная. Я твоя не первая, ты моя случайная. Покажи, 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 покажи мне любовь. Покажи, 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 почему я с тобой. Покажи, 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 покажи мне любовь. Покажи, 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 почему я с тобой.
Anybody knows the band? Ah, thank you. That saved me. It would have been very sad if nobody knew the band. So, yeah, it's actually, as you see, I'm a fan, and I had to do something about it. So that's The Worker. So The Worker addresses labor as such, and he sings, and that's the refrain of the song, which is, of course, a totally different song. I'm kind of taking it away and reinterpreting it. Show me your love, show me your love. That's kind of what is in the chorus, or how do you say? Is it refrain? Is in German, right? That was German English. So yeah, in the chorus, show me your love, and it's important. He's moving in this normative way and exactly in the way that the song asks for, and this song and also the group Tattoo, it has many more dimensions, but this would lead too far to discuss that right now. So I'm going on to talk a little bit more about this work. So all three characters have to pass through their own phantasma, and it doesn't end well. And all this is conveyed through using sound, the pictures, the performances, and the book placed in space. So that was that. Next work. The Woman Who Never Flew into Space from 2009. So this work takes a concrete look into the realization of socialist utopia in the Soviet Union of the 1960s, that is space travel. And the title is a play on Ilya Kabakov's 1988 installation, The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment. If you don't know Ilya Kabakov, it's no shame, but you really should know his work. So it's Ilya Kabakov, really great Soviet Russian artist with very important art. So the space is, in this case, organized through these black circle shape and red lightning, and it's clearly a play on Russian constructivism of the 1910 to 1925 period. The left object it's called Capsule, and it has the diameter of a spaceship of a Soviet spaceship of the 1960s. So when you stand there on the outside, you can actually stretch your hand, but if you're inside, you can't stretch your hand anymore. Like when you would sit in that capsule that is shot into space, into vacuum, and then maybe returns to Earth, then you would have, in front of you, you would have like this much space where you could move your hands, and then you would sit like that in that thing. And it's not just one, the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, who went up in that thing, but it were like, I don't know exactly, but 6 to 9 people who traveled to space with that. It's accompanied by a 45-minute audio play, so you can sit there in the background and listen to it. And the story is about Valentina Panamaeva, who was almost the first woman in space. But she was selected as a backup cosmonaut to the actual first woman in space. She was trained, but she never flew. So her training partner, Valentina Tereshkova, was deemed more presentable. And here's a picture of that's Tereshkova, that's Gagarin, first man in space, visiting my birth country, German Democratic Republic, but before I was born in the 60s. And here on the left, there's a picture of Valentina Panamaeva, who didn't go into space. Unlike Panamaeva, Tereshkova was not a mother. And also during the training, she was obeying all orders. So the story that I'm telling is organized in 5 chapters, from the selection for cosmonaut training to the 1990s and the fall of the Soviet Union. And to actually create the story, I interviewed Panamaeva 2010 in her home in Moscow, which was a very impressive interview. She was then 78 years old. And I created a partly fictional radio play based on her life. The work deals with gender roles and technology in the Soviet Union space travel program. And it is accompanied by this installation. These are 5 out of 19 pictures. That's the Choir of the Dead Space Travelers. So it's 19 cosmonauts and astronauts who died during space travel until now. So if there's going to be more death, this installation is going to be extended. The front side has black velvet, which creates a total black. It sucks in all light, so no light can be emitted. So it's very darkish. In front of it is a glass frame that creates some sort of reflections. And on the back of those framed pictures is the actual portrait of a person. So each cosmonaut and each astronaut has his or her own portrait on the back. And the audience never gets to see the backside. So only during setup of the work, the curator and maybe the art handler, and of course me, the artist, gonna see what's on the back. So what we have here are ghosts, and they are ghosts of failure in the public memory. And the premise from which I'm starting is, as an astronaut, when you're going up, you're a dead person. And just by a mere coincidence, should the experimental technology actually function, you're gonna survive, you're gonna land on Earth again, and you're gonna live on. And then even if you live on, the question is, okay, what are you now? Because you have been in space, now the best thing that you can do is talk in front of school classes. So this is kind of what, that's the trajectory of an astronaut and a cosmonaut. So the Choir of Dead Space Travelers is present not just as objects in space, but also in the narration. And therefore I worked with an actual choir. It's called Ensemble Vocal Consort, based in Leipzig. So I wrote them a text, and their director created a kind of a mumbling, singing choir from it. The choir introduces all its participants, like Gagarin, Komarov, but also McAuliffe and Scooby. And it then introduces the protagonist, that is Valentina Panamayeva, and claims, we will see now how she rose and fell. And I'm just playing a very short audio sample, just that you see it's very, in a way, very German and Brechtian, how I deal with that, or how they dealt with the text also.
Wir wollen nun hören, wie sie aufstieg und fiel, wie der Traum vom Weltraum
ein Traum nur blieb.
And this introduces the radio play, and then I have several actors who speak several roles, and it's like very kind of a traditional radio play from that point on. So this is the form. And yeah, part of the artistic research was the interview that I made with Panamayeva, and it was luckily published, and also a text, an accompanying text that I wrote was published about her entanglement in male-dominated engineering cultures of the 1960s in the Soviet Union. So in my practice, I have this double access to historical material, the research of historical facts on the one hand, and the fictionalization on the other hand. Yeah. So after looking at Utopia's accomplishments and failures in the East, I turned to the West, and that's next work. Yeah, so this piece is called Utopia Generator in 2015. It's a space full of energy and heat created from the lamps and the fans of 20 slide projectors. It's really great technology because you can get them very cheap. So I could have 20 of them and could create this very dense texture of reflections on the wall. I constructed this diamond-shaped mirror thing together with a a student of industrial design. So it was a collaboration, very helpful because it's not so easy to construct. And on the walls, there is a projection of names of 160 actual utopian communities in the US between 1860 and 1920, collected by the historian Robert S. Fogarty. So these were 160 communities that existed for between 3 and 7 years mostly. Then most of them broke down, or some of them are still, like 5 to 7 are still existing. And I think, if I remember right, Aspen is one of them. So there you have Christians, utopian socialists, Fourierists, Hutterites and pragmatics in Northern America. But again, there is a kind of a dirty downside of this utopic dream. And in this case, it's obvious. It's the land seizure following the eviction and genocide of Native Americans to create the space to realize these utopic ideas. So, next work. Deep Love Algorithm from 2013. After my work about utopias, about modernity and technology, now I began to I felt like, okay, I have researched the topic as an artist, but also on a more historical, theoretical level, and where do I want to move my practice next? That also it fell together with, okay, I was like 10 years out of art school, and the first wave of energy that you have when you finish art school, it was used up, I would say. So I had like 2 years that were a bit more low and slower, and then I felt, okay, so what's the one thing that would interest me to do? And this was databases, and the work that I'm talking about now, Deep Love Algorithm, that's a purely fictional work. It was again a cooperation with a photographer, Sebastian Hümer, and with an audio designer and DJ Cornelia Friederike Müller, and obviously 2 friends of mine who were the actors, and that's a Leipzig Café street scene that we see there. Let me go into detail. So this storyline has 2 protagonists. Jan, he's a journalist. So over there, that's Jan. And Margaret, she is his editor. There she is, Margaret. And they go on a journey to find out when, how, and why databases were invented. So they also look into the utopian potential of database technology. And the thing is that it comes true at some point in the story. Margaret magically already lives much longer than it appears, and well, it might be she's a cyborg or so. We don't know exactly. At some point, they are close to fall in love with each other, and somehow this doesn't work out. And this was a good reason to include a few very sad love songs, for instance, by, that one is not so sad, by house legend Mark Kinchen with singer Alana, but also by Aretha Franklin or by Lykke Li. And this sadness is a reference to the tragedy of database technology. It could be used in a utopian way, but actually at the moment it's mostly used as a data extraction tool. And this is really sad, isn't it? So I had to deal with a difficult spatial situation. As you see here, we have these open, these windows with these strange things there. Then suddenly this wall comes up into the space, and I got this beautifully checkered floor. And there I should kind of do something so it's not the white cube space that you, as an artist, would hope for, because it makes things easier, so it got more complicated. I reacted by introducing these two displays. So this one is an actual video projection. There's a projector, here's a projection. This one, in the same size of the video projection, is digital print. The content of the print, the picture, refers to what you see in the video. The visitors would enter from here, and they would go in here into this space. So I felt like, okay, I still have to deal with this space, and what am I going to do with it? I'm trying to introduce the story by having these two, I call them small black towers, that also feature scene from the video. I'm not so certain anymore if that actually worked out artistically well. Yeah, so sometimes you just do stuff and then you see it like a few years later and you think, well, not really. Anyway, I'm still very proud of the video that I made, and I still like it very much. So the 30-minute video has a special form which reminds of subtitles, of chat messages, or silent movie titles. And each of the 6 chapters is introduced by a sequence of photographs that show the protagonists in the scene, and then the dialogue follows. And I'm gonna play a longer excerpt, like 10 minutes or so, from this, and these are from this Deep Love algorithm, and it's the last 2 chapters, chapters 8 and 9, and just only chapter 9, it doesn't begin with a sequence of images, it directly jumps into the dialogue, and the images come in the end of the sequence before everything ends. Yeah, and maybe I also should mention that what you're seeing here is the dialogue of 2 characters at all times, and they differentiate by the font that is being used. So the one person has one font and the other person has the other font. Yeah, you get how it works. Formerly, I was interested to take apart all the individual elements. So there are pictures, but they are not synchronized with the sound. There's spoken text, but again, it's somewhere in between, and it's not, you can't see the actors speak. So I was deconstructing the timelines in a way. And you see how the story develops. There's much more. It's 30 minutes long, so it takes quite an affordance to see the whole thing for the visitors in the exhibition. I'm going to skip this. This is a data body from 2018. It's on my website. All my views are on my website, so you can just watch it there just to see this beautiful part. So let me sum it up. Storytelling is a specific interdisciplinary method in visual arts, overlapping with art forms that have storytelling at their heart, like in a novel or in a movie or in a radio play. It is prone to the pitfall of explaining too much and showing too little. And I think in some of my artworks, this actually happens. So I'm explaining too much, I'm giving too many explanations to the visitor what's going on there. I'm not showing enough. I should change that. But it has the power to relate technological change to social change while exploring the aesthetic dimension of both. It has the power to relate technological change to social change while exploring the aesthetic dimension of both. Two more comments. You may ask how my art, and especially the historical perspective in it, is relevant for today's urgent questions like climate change or in regards to a post-colonial perspective. And without going too deep into it, I want to give some examples. So looking into the moments of failure, of actually realized utopias, I think it's of utmost importance for current debates because it can show us possible mistakes which shouldn't be repeated because they could easily lead to some million deaths. That's what Stalinism was. So, and the second comment regarding the post-colonial perspective, so currently we're moving forward to an all-encompassing digital colonization of human subjectivity through data extraction. So every thought that I and you have, every move that we make is made into data. What does it mean for us? Where is that going? An anti-colonial perspective on data is urgently needed, and I see my work as on the database as a kind of a basic research. It's very basic research that has to be done in that direction. So, thanks a lot to you for listening, and now I would welcome not only questions, but also comments.
One of the books that you share with us talk about appropriation. I just
About
get
what?
appropriation.
Uh-huh.
Appropriation.
Is it the yellow book? The
yeah,
exhibition?
the yellow.
Ah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I would like to know a little bit more about what is your view about the appropriation and the copyright of those materials in artworks.
Mm-hmm. And why would you want to know it? Could you, like...
Because your aesthetics reminds a lot, mainly in videos, reminds a lot those videos that we all do nowadays, very YouTube, Instagram videos, and I would love to know what are your thoughts about it, this environment for video today, and this use of the images and the sounds and the cultural production that's already there.
Yeah. Well, let me maybe first comment on that book. So this is an exhibition which I co-curated with Inka Arns. She's one of the best media art curators in Germany, in my opinion. She does, yeah. So I was very honored to work with her, and we were inviting, so I wasn't there as an artist, we were inviting other artists who deal with questions of copyright in 2008, and we had very different positions. Some positions which just said, okay, I'm gonna appropriate everything. I don't care about any copyright, because that's what artists have to do. I'm just doing that. I'm just taking it for me, and now it's mine, and I'm gonna show it again. And others that looked into how digital rights management in data files can destroy exchange. So things like that we were interested in, especially in an age when at that time it became clear that it is so easy to copy anything, and it was also the time frame 2008 when it became clear that copyright restrictions would become more enforced. So, and today, if when you're watching YouTube and you're not logged in, then you see lots of advertisement, and this is kind of a reaction of how YouTube tries to deal with the question of copyright. So they want to pay the copyright holders, but it only shows how destructive. I mean, I'm listening to let's say a symphony, a piano concert by Chopin, and then in the midst of it comes bam, 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 ba, 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 ba. That's crazy. I mean, it's like it's really crazy to do that, and it's violent against the beauty of the art that I try to experience. So they are really good in like moving me away from their own platform by that. And then about my own use of certain tropes, so to say, I think I use them in a very abstract way, and sometimes I think they might be even too abstract, so you don't even notice it. but it's really a comment on questions of user interfaces and user interface design and how it formats our viewing and our thinking. Yeah, I don't know if it doesn't matter. So you should ask again if I should answer in more detail. Yeah. Yeah. Well, next one. Come on, give me questions.
I have a question, but I don't know how to make this question. So
Just start.
exactly, it's not. It's more about the theory of your work than of your work itself. So I'm interested if you relate the idea of technology, how we figure out the idea of technology today as a continuous of what was the concept of techne, and if your work in these times, so in our times, is also related to the fact that in the last century a lot of people spoke about the idea that technique now went probably, but at the time was going over the capacity of human to have the control on it. So like I think at the work of Spengler, the sunset of Westward, Heidegger, the end of humanism, Gunther Anders, the man is old. And this fact that you mentioned it at the end of your talks about digital colonialism, it can be related to the idea that this is the first generation that experience the concept of digital memory, so database and not just something that is already in the cyberspace. And also, if you know what you think of ACT, like, do you know who is Aaron Swartz? Who was Aaron Swartz? Was a guy that wrote the Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto in 2008. And
which manifesto?
Guerrilla Open Access
okay.
Manifesto that he wrote in 2008. I think he was like 20 years old at the time, and then he get suicide, but after get a big trial from multinational of database and like control of information and data in this idea of cyberspace. I don't know if it's a question, but
thanks a lot for directing me towards this Guerrilla Open Access Manifesto. I don't know it, and I'm going to look it up. Could you elaborate a little bit more of what your question was about the techne? What is the concept of techne, and why do you want to ask me about that?
I want to ask you about that because the fact that now so we are habituated to think about technology as object or something that we can use, but now the next step of the idea of technology is went over and became untouchable. So from the idea of something that is directly approachable from the sense of the human is now something that is more difficult to understand, even if there is a big hardware part on the idea of technology. So like internet is not just cyberspace, but there is a big hardware component above the software component. So that was a little bit the context of my question. Mm-hmm. I think in today's life we lost a little, no, not just I think, I'm pretty sure that we lost what can happen when we make something, not me, we as a collectivity making something with technology and we don't have the control on what's going to happen later, like the self-generating algorithms and stuff like this.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I would very much say that the idea that technology exists by itself and is kind of growing above us, that's a kind of an ideology in itself, yeah. And it's a very popular ideology at the moment. So if you look into the discussion around so-called artificial intelligence, which I would not call intelligence, but pattern recognition, because it can recognize patterns in data sets. And there's like, really my daughters are just, they go to school and I see what intelligence comprises. Or for instance, for myself, I have a high blood pressure and it makes something in my thinking. So the body belongs to the thinking, and all that doesn't happen with those things that are called artificial intelligence. So I think that's a kind of a big fantasy in a way, and it tells a lot about our society. Why do we have this fantasy? Why do we construct this other that is the machine, that is not us, that can be upon us, that can destroy us? So that's one thing. The other thing, to go in more practical terms, I think that there are many people involved in creating these kind of complex technologies, and most of them, they are called engineers, software engineers, programmers, and I think one of the problems with this kind of fantasy that the technology controls us, the humans, is that it's very easy for engineers to deny their own responsibility. But they are creating this stuff, they are programming it. And I'm saying it also includes me, because I'm also working as a software programmer. So I'm part of the problem and part of it. And I think that's very important to see, because the argument is always, it seems like these systems can act autonomously on their self, but the first point is, why is the system there at all? It's because some human has decided to put it there and to put it into action collectively with others. And the second is, how can we access what has happened in these figurations of algorithms, of data, of information models, of the infrastructure that is surrounding it, like the cloud computing centers and so on. And if I'm thinking of that, at all points there are humans involved, but it's very difficult because it's so many humans at so many different places. It's very different to hold anybody accountable for what's going on there. And I think that's, so in my opinion, this feeling that this technique is kind of being forced on us, that's a reaction to the fact that it's so difficult to address concrete political actors. And what is interesting in this context are groups like the Tech Workers Union that organizes itself in California, where tech workers working for Facebook, Google, and so on try to be responsible with what they are doing, and also try to unionize and to fight and they try to solve the problem that we are actually having, not in a technological way, but in a social way. And that's like really interesting for me. And that's also, to me, it seems like the possible solution. So whenever anybody comes to you and says like, oh, you have a problem, I have very good technological idea to solve it. No. This person is bad. Yeah. For instance, like people coming to you and say, yeah, let's do it with blockchain. Okay, come on, please, no. Let's talk about how to cooperate as humans, how to be able to organize and to talk with each other and then find ways to solve problems. Maybe this has answered a little bit. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for the
In your work, the Satan Conspiracy, especially given what you've just said, and that you're really interested in storytelling and data, and you said that in the work you didn't let any of the viewers respond to anything that you were saying. If your work is now going to take a more like an idea of power as an exchange, like you mentioned Foucault, and you want to listen to people's stories, wouldn't it be quite interesting to let the people respond to you and what you're saying, especially if you were showing it in different places where I'm sure the ideas of both data and the Soviet Union together would prompt some like fascinating discussions. I don't know, just would you be interested in hearing that from them or not?
Yeah, thanks. Very good suggestion. As I said before, I left out the workshops, and they are especially places for creating interchange. Like there was this one workshop on satellite technology where we would, which I organized, co-organized, where we would walk around the city and try to identify how and where satellite technology is used, how satellites are being received. We tried to interview people. We went into shops that had satellite dishes and tried to interview them about their usage. And it was a group of people that did that, like artists, invited artists. Another example is a database walk, which I did in Berlin. So we went through the city and tried to identify the visible ends of databases. And it was done in a way that, of course, I would talk initially, but then I would really much look into, okay, what would other people say? And there were some really interesting stories coming up. We saw that each tree on a street, it has its own number. So this is a very good kind of, it's showing very well, okay, this tree may be in the database, and if this tree is going to die, then the city of Berlin going to replace exactly the tree number 291. But in the piece, in the Satan Conspiracy, it was very intentional to not have a talk. I was really interested also in exercising the power myself, like, so to say, to be as fascist as possible, yeah? Because I think that we also, to be able to critically speak about these kind of positions, we also have to experience them ourselves to really get an understanding of why and how it is also, so great to be in power, yeah? Like, beginning from the doorman to the immigration officer, everybody who can kind of say, yeah, don't do that, do that. Interesting, very interesting about humans also. Did that answer your question? Yeah, okay, thanks.
So I have a question which is more about data, or I call information versus physical objects. So, because as we learn, or as we know, object has its own languages as well, or own reference as a physical existence in the world. Like, for example, the cat you just showed us is a cat, as an image of a cat, or when we see a cat, it's a cat. That object or that cat has its own reference or own information. But versus data, it's only information without object. So I wonder how you unpack the language of the existing systems and then realize your visual languages in your research project.
Francis, could I ask you to try to summarize the question just so that the people in the back
Yeah, well, it was a very good question, but it's also a very complicated question. And I hope I'm getting it right. So the question was data versus object, and the idea is that an object has a reference to something that actually exists in the world, while data has not that direct reference, but I didn't get why data wouldn't have this direct reference. Would you elaborate on that?
This is information. So information versus object would be more
Because because it is information, and yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think or information versus that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Simulacrum.
Let me answer not from an artistic perspective, but now I'm really answering in a media theoretic way from my PhD research on databases. So where to start? Maybe the first interesting thing is the question, what is data and what is not data? Yeah. And if you're specifically talking about databases, then a database has a data model. And the data model, it describes which part of reality is being included in the database. So it exists for the database and for computing, and which parts of reality are irrelevant to the question that is going to be asked through the database. So everything that is irrelevant for the question that is going to be asked from the perspective of the database, that's non-data. And the other part of reality that becomes data at that point when you record it. And of course you have lots of complications because data is an interpretation of reality. I think that's a little bit where you wanted to go for. Yeah, I might interpret this as red. The photo camera might interpret this as orange. And then at some point there was an engineer who defined if this is red or orange for the database in a way. So for databases, for most of the databases, I have to say, we have a so-called closed world assumption. And the closed world assumption is the world is everything that is in the database, everything that's outside is not existing. And I can ask a question to the database and it will give me an answer that is right or wrong. And it does not make the differentiation that if something is not in the database, it might simply be because it doesn't know about it, but in the closed world assumption, it's just not there. So now we are asking about the reference to the object.
That's okay. I know it's really complicated.
That's actually, I think it's too complicated to answer it right now. Also, also I have to say that some thoughts I'm only able to do in writing actually. So I have to write it down and then I can eventually read it to you. But it's not possible to answer everything. Yeah. So there's one more question.
Yeah, I have a question.
One addendum. The interesting point is information model, the decision about what becomes data and what not, that's very, very political because there's a decision being made about what's reality and what not, what is processable and what not. And the problem in the current discourse is everybody talks about the algorithm. I always hear algorithm, 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 algorithm. And I think like, well, what algorithm? It's the data model. Dear, come on, it's the data model. That's where politics happens and where we should talk about and where bias happens, for instance. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. I am very interested in one of the things that you mentioned in the last part, because I work a lot with semiotics, and I found like very interesting right now to also include or think about this concept of data. And then I was wondering if you will have like any recommendation on like an introductory like literature on the conversation of data in the idea of like semiotics in the history of like semiotics.
Of what?
in semiotics, in the discourse of semiotics, if there is like any literature that you know that then starts talking about data in that sense too. I mean, maybe more contemporary lecture on that.
Yeah, well, semiotics is difficult because I didn't read much about that myself. I can give a few pointers regarding the question of data. What I found very enlightening was not to think about data from the perspective of cybernetics, but much more from the perspective of office work. Like in archives, in libraries, and in office work, in the last century, lots of data has been created, and they had growing problems to process the data. And who has written about it is, for instance, Joanne Yates. So last name is Yatas and ES, thanks. She wrote a book in 2005, Structuring the Information Age, Life Insurance and Technology in the 20th Century. Then a really great book is by, let me look it up. That's Markus Krajewski. Last name is Krajewski. Markus Krajewski. It's called Paper Machines About Cards and Catalogs, 1584 till 1929. And to me, it was like really a revelation to think about data in terms of paper catalogs and cards and because that's the early digital already. And the early digital, it happens in 1548 and not in 2007. Yeah. Well, you're going to send me an email and I'm going to send you more recommendations, okay? Yeah, so it's in here.
I think we have time for one more question. It's,
yeah.
8:05.
Yeah.
One more maybe?
Yes, please.
If there is one.
If there's one.
What you just described about a closed world assumption, is it true for the Soviet computer too, that has 3 options?
Yeah.
Yeah? So for the option that says both yes and no, is still the data that you put in that world, right?
It's still an exact state. It really took me some time to wrap my head around it and to understand the concept. So, like some of you may know not just the decimal calculation system, but also the hexadecimal notation and binary notation. So the ternary is just in the same way. You're calculating your stuff with 3 different states of logic, and they are very exact states of logic. And it was kind of a disappointment for me also because, of course, in the beginning, I was also thinking like, wow, the Russians had a computer that had this kind of very strange thing going on there. And then I learned, okay, but still it's a very interesting point to look at why it was possible at that time to build this computer, which was a non-binary computer, which is different from what all the other world at that time built. Why did the US never build such a computer? Why did they stop building this computer in the 1970s? So for me, that journey was very rewarding. Yeah. Okay, thanks.